Chapter 4, Verbal Messages. Here are the main three purposes of Chapter 4. Basically, in studying this chapter, we're going to consider why two people can interpret the same message differently, leading to miscommunication and the perceived inability to achieve shared meaning. By the end of the chapter, my hope is that you would have some new strategies in your toolbox for developing stronger verbal messages to better achieve your communication goals. In this video, we'll go through the following knowledge checkpoints. We'll examine the fundamentals of language, we'll answer the question, what is language, and we'll consider how language can differ between communities. Finally, we'll make connections back to previous chapters to help you build on your current knowledge of communication, which, impressively, is way more in depth than a few weeks ago. So go ahead and pat yourself on the back for all your hard work. You deserve it. Now let's keep going strong with our first checkpoint. The fundamentals of language. The fundamentals of language can be thought of as the foundations of every language, or the aspects of language that every person must learn in order to use the language appropriately. In other words, whether we speak French, Spanish, English, or one of the other 7,000 languages in the world, we all start by learning three fundamental skills. So what are they? First, we have utterances. Utterances are units of talk bounded by silence, which can be literal or figurative. Can you guess why this definition says units of talk rather than speech? If ASL, or American Sign Language, came to mind, you would be correct. ASL is not orally spoken through speech, but it is nonetheless language used to communicate. So let's translate and connect this. Utterances refer to sentence formation or encoding, which is the basis of message construction. The reason silence can be literal or figurative is the difference between talking face-to-face or waiting to send a text. An example of the latter would be those of you who like to use your read receipts to communicate your feelings. You know who you are. Next, we have turn-taking, or the exchanging of utterances, also known as having a conversation. That's just a basic understanding of that. This is the basis of message interpretation in which one decodes verbal messages and provides feedback. Finally, we have the uses of language, which includes labeling, comparing, and learning. It's important to note here that the uses of communication and language differ. A communication is used to meet a range of needs, like social needs or physical needs. I mean, there's a huge gamut of needs that we meet with our communication. Language, on the other hand, is used as a vessel for our communication, meaning it's what allows us to meet our communication needs through the action of interaction coordination. Overall, these three uses are what help us establish shared meaning with others. Okay, now that you better understand the fundamentals of language, let's practice identifying them in an example. Pause the video and see if you can identify which aspects of this example illustrate or act as the signifiers for the terms and concepts we just covered. When you're done, press play to check your work. All right, here's what I got. Feel free to pause the video again to look it over. How'd you do? If you didn't do as well as you wanted, you can let me know by using the optional end of chapter discussion forum. On this forum, this is where students can just ask questions and kind of get clarification for anything that they're not quite getting in the chapter. Just make sure that whenever you write a post that you write it in the form of a question, not just something like, I don't get utterances. That's not very helpful. That can kind of just open to a big gamut of things that I could talk about. So try to be specific and write it in the form of a question. Okay, let's move to checkpoint 2. What is language? This is actually a pretty philosophical question when we think about it, but to keep it simple, languages can be defined as a system of symbols used to communicate. Symbols is just a sciencey term for words. What this definition is really getting to is that on a daily basis, you and I systematically use a collection of words or a language to articulate our thoughts through the construction of verbal messages, which of course is a significant portion of the communication process known as encoding. So why is this important? Well, to be an effective communicator, we have to recognize that the level to which we achieve shared meaning is greatly dependent on our ability to tailor verbal messages to the people we encounter. And whether we realize it or not, this is actually a learnable skill directly related to our word choices, which leads us to the three parts of language that impact our word choices. All languages consist of three basic components. The first of these is lexicon, which refers to the collection of words and expressions that make up a language. For example, the word apple is part of an English speaker's lexicon. Next is phonology, which is simply the pronunciation of words. For example, would you say caramel or would you say caramel, like caramel apple or caramel apple? Finally, we have syntax and grammar, which deals with the rules of combining words to form sentences. For example, English speakers would say caramel apple, placing the descriptive word before the subject, while Spanish speakers would say manzana de caramelo, or apple of caramel, which places the descriptive word after the subject. A syntax example would be like English speakers only placing a question mark at the end of a sentence, while Spanish speakers would place question marks before and after, and they would even put on the beginning the question mark upside down. Finally, a grammar example would be an English speaker saying, "How do you like them apples?" which would be an incorrect use of the word them. To simplify everything I just said, let's go ahead and apply our knowledge to a basic example. Again, pause the video and answer the following fill-in-the-blank practice questions. When you're ready, press play for my answers. All right, here's the correct order. Again, how did you do? And again, if you didn't do as well as you wanted, or if you feel like you need a little more clarification, just remember to post your question on the end of chapter discussion forum, and I'll be happy to respond to it. Next, let's talk about checkpoint 3, language and community. Every person who understands and communicates using a particular language is part of that language's language community. However, large language communities, like the English language, are broken into dialects, or different forms of the same language. Within each dialect, we then find speech communities, which are smaller groups of people who speak their own version of the dominant culture's dialect. Further still, each person within a speech community has their own unique dialect, which is referred to as their idiolect. Idiolects are made up of our personal collection of words, phonetics, and sentence structure habits. I honestly find idiolects incredibly fascinating because they're kind of like a snapshot into someone's past experiences and cultural identity. Because if you think about it, the cultures we identify with have a major impact on how we define the words in our vocabulary and our reasons for using them. Like the party versus get-together example I talked about with my mom in chapter 1. Another important aspect of idiolects to consider is how they very much impact others' perceptions of us and our perceptions of them. This is why communication with people whose idiolects differ greatly from our own has the potential to cause a bit of psychological discomfort, which we know to be culture shock, which can sometimes lead to inaccurate perceptions of that person. Pause the video and take a second to look over the examples and connections section of the slide to better understand each term and how they could be used in a sentence. When you're ready, press play for one last exam prep question. All right, here's your last exam practice question, which is in the form of a personal application. Once again, pause the video and fill in the blanks for each term using yourself as the reference. When you're ready, press play and you'll see the answers that I provided for myself. Here are my answers. I'm an English speaker who speaks American English influenced by the Southern U.S. speech community and millennial generation co-culture I grew up in. An example of how my Southern roots influence my idiolect is the way I say egg instead of egg. And a millennial example would be that I say, that's what's up, when I think something's cool. Hopefully you got those right since they're about yourself, but if not, feel free to change them because I'll never know. So there you go. All right, last but not least, our final checkpoint is this video's concept connections. I'm going to quickly answer these questions for you, but before I do, I again want you to pause the video and see if you can identify at least one term that would work as the answer to the question. You don't have to write out the answers full out. I just want you to simply list a term that comes to mind. So pause the video and restart when you're ready. Here are the answers that came to mind for me. If they weren't the answers that you gave, that's okay. As long as you can articulate your reasoning for why these answers made sense on a test, then you'd receive a good grade. If you're confused or you don't feel like you get what I'm asking for when you see questions like this, again, feel free to post about this on the discussion forum for me to answer, but make sure that you form it into a question, not just like, I don't get concept connections. Try to say, I don't understand concept connections when it's formed this way because of this reason, or however what makes sense to you. But just try not to keep it quite so open-ended. All right, that's all for this video. In our next video, we'll discuss how meaning is applied to verbal messages.